This is our second class on the second chapter of the second part of the Tanya. Last time, we had an action-packed class. We're explaining that chapter 2 picks up right where chapter 1 left off. Chapter 1 told us, based on faith, based on what it says in the Midrash, we learned from the sages, that what are heaven and earth and everything that's within them, they are the Word of God. That it is the Word of God that constantly stands within them and is creating them constantly. Which means that everything that exists is utterly dependent, and its very nature derives from God at every moment. It depends on God, its nature derives from God at every single moment, and if God were to stop speaking the world into existence, even for a moment, it would revert to absolute nothingness.
That's right.
Yes? We said in chapter 2 that we are going to begin to explain this to the heretics, to the minim, to those who deny a fundamental truth of the Torah. And we explained that who are these heretics really? The heretics is really referring to us. The heretic is the animal soul. What does the heretic say? What is the shita? What is the philosophical position of this heretic? The heretic says that God has abandoned the world. God is not involved in the creation of the world anymore, and the world can exist on its own. And because he denies that, he denies God's involvement, he denies miracles, he denies essentially that anything runs the world other than the world's own nature. What is the root of his mistake? What is the root of the heresy? The root of the heresy is the idea that God's actions, God's creation of the world is the same as man's creation of an object or an artifact, something that a human being creates. And we explained, when a human being creates something, a silversmith takes a piece of silver and he makes it into a cup or a menorah or into something, he can go walk in the market, he can go be in the shuk somewhere and no longer be forming this thing, and yet the thing will remain in its new form. He took the piece of silver, he melted it and formed it into the shape of a menorah, and now it remains a menorah even if he's no longer there. Right? As opposed to God, when God creates something, God cannot leave it to be on its own. If God were to stop creating it at any moment, it would simply cease to exist. The human craftsman, on the other hand, when he creates something, it continues to exist even when he is no longer there and he is no longer working to create it. And at the end of last week's class, we're going to pick up exactly where we ended last week. We began to talk about the idea of the tziyur, the idea of the form. Because to really understand what formation means, what it means that the artisan, the silversmith, forms from the silver a certain artifact or a certain object, from this we will understand the difference between formation and creation, the difference between what the human artisan is doing and what God is doing. And really this explanation has many, many, many details, and it gets to a lot of depth and is quite complicated. So God willing, we are going to take it slowly, bit by bit, and we're going to explain it so that everyone understands it, God willing. So we're going to go through this piece by piece. So what did we explain at the very end of last week's class? At the very end of last week's class, we explained that when a human being, when a human artisan forms an object from material, he takes silver and he makes it into a menorah. What is he really doing? Right? Really, he's changing the form of the object. The object was in the form of a block of silver, and now an ingot or whatever it is, and now it's in the form of a vessel, whether it's a menorah, whether it's a cup. He has essentially changed its form. And as we discussed last week, what is he really doing? He's not really giving it the form entirely anew, right? As we said, you can't form water into a menorah. You can't form fire into a menorah. Only silver can be formed into a menorah, which tells us what? Which tells us that silver is the type of thing that has in it the potential to be a menorah, right? As opposed to water, which does not have that potential, right? is at a very basic level. We could spend more time on this in truth and qualify it and explain it in more depth, but this is really only incidental. This is just a small part of the argument. So let's assume that this is the case, right? We're speaking at a very simple level. Last week there were questions also about spiritual creations, which it's true. The Tanya is also talking about spiritual creations. Spiritual creations are much more complicated. We're going to talk about the simple physical creation, and that's going to be our metaphor for understanding this, right? Because remember, the entire purpose of discussing a human creation, a human artifact, is to say that the way God creates something is completely different, right? So this is only a metaphor. We're explaining that when a human does something, it's one way, and when God does it, it's completely different. So when a human being takes the ingot of silver and he forms it into a menorah, right? He's bringing out the potential that exists within the silver to be in the shape of the menorah. Which means, in other words, this is the fundamental distinction between someone who forms and someone who creates. When he is forming, when he is bringing out the shape that was there, right? I think it was Michelangelo who said that if you want to sculpt something, you just remove all the marble that's not that thing, and the sculpture's left over. It's simple, right? All you have to do is you take the block of marble, you remove everything that's not the thing, and the sculpture is left over, right? That's how you sculpt. Simple.
As long as it's on the right piece.
Yeah, exactly. That seems to be most of the trick. Apparently not everyone could be a Michelangelo, or there would be more Michelangelos, right? So the idea is the same, right? The idea is the same. The form, just as the statue is there in the marble, right? So too the menorah is there in the silver. So too with every other human artifact. There is a potential for it to be in this form, for it to be in this shape of the artifact, and all he needs to do is bring that out. That's essentially what he's doing. He forms it into a new form. He takes the silver that is one way, he removes the way that it is, he makes it stop being an ingot or a block of silver, and he makes it be another way that the silver can be. And the silver has the potential to be many, 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 many different things. And one of the things it has the potential to be is this menorah, and he forms it into the menorah. Therefore, the human artisan is not a creator. The human artisan only forms. Why? Because why is this form able to exist, right? Why is it that when he goes and walks in the market, the menorah can sit there on his table and still maintain its form? And the answer is because really that's exactly what the menorah was doing before he formed it. The menorah was sitting on his table inside the ingot of silver when it was just a block. And now that he's brought out the menorah that was within the silver, in other words, he brought out the potential for it to be this form and actualized it. He actualized that potential. He made it real. He took the silver's ability to be a menorah and made it into an actual menorah, right? It sits and exists in his table exactly as it did before he ever showed up. In other words, what is his involvement? His involvement is really only in the transformation from one state to the other. There's a state where it's an ingot. I'm saying a state like in the sense of computer programming is really where my language is coming from. I'm sure it's from other things as well. So you have a multi-state system. Right? In state, you'll have a switch that's open in state 1 and closed in state 2. So the same thing here. There's a starting state, picture A, state A, it's a block of silver. State B, it's a menorah. To get from state A to state B, you need a sculptor. But for state A to exist, you obviously didn't need a sculptor because the silver existed before the sculptor was ever there. The silver probably existed before the sculptor was even born. Never mind before the sculptor made it into a menorah.
And state B can always come back to state 1, state A.
Correct. But also, even when state B remains state B, right, it doesn't need the sculptor at every moment because it's just like state A. The only difference is that a different potential has been brought out, a different form has been brought out. So in other words, the menorah really was always there, and the only difference is that at first it was potential, but now it's actual. So the existence of the menorah really piggybacks, right? It rides on, it is dependent on the existence of the silver. Because the silver is here, so too the menorah can be here, right? Because that is one of the many forms that's inherent in the silver. It's just one of the ways for the silver to be is as a menorah. And really all the sculptor is changing is the way that the silver is.
But it's also dependent on the sculpture.
Say again?
It's also dependent on the sculpture, because without him it won't happen.
Yes, that's true. So it's different, but here's the point. The point is, you're right. It needs the sculpture to make it be in a certain way, to make it be as a menorah. But what is its being? Right. Its being preceded the sculptor and will probably last after the sculptor. The sculptor can walk away in the shuk, the sculptor can pass away, God forbid. The menorah remains, right? The form, the way of being of this piece of silver is totally independent of him. Really, all he was needed for was the transition. But the existence of the silver preceded him, and the existence of the silver is now here even after he leaves. All he does is change the way that the silver is, or to use a more technical and precise philosophical language, he actualizes a potential form within the silver, and that's all that he does. But the form was always there in potential, now it's here in actual, and what is it a form of? This block of silver that already existed. So in other words, the question then becomes, in what sense is the sculptor making the menorah exist? And the answer is, he's not really. He's not really making it exist. He is part of the process of bringing it about, but its existence preceded him. The menorah was there before the sculptor ever came along in potential. The existence of the menorah rides on and piggybacks on the existence of the silver, which preceded the sculptor and which is there even after he leaves. And therefore, the sculptor is not really required to be there. That's why the sculptor is not required to be there constantly. Why would he be, right? When you explain it like this, it becomes a question, why would the sculptor need to be there, right? Just as as long as you can say, right, it's almost like it's dependent on an axiom. I don't want to confuse things. But as long as you can say, as long as you have the premise, as long as it's a given, right, that the silver exists, then it's just as easy for the menorah to exist. Right? The only difference is getting this more complicated form, which wouldn't occur naturally in nature, you need a silversmith to bring it out. Right? But just as the silver can exist, given that the silver exists, so too the menorah exists. The menorah is just a detail or a certain formation of the silver's existing, which really preceded the sculptor. Yes?
So what's problematic about that?
Nothing's problematic about that at all. We're saying that's not the way that God creates the universe, right? So that's really only the first half. And once that's understood, that that's what the sculptor is doing, that he forms the object, right? Then we say what God is doing is really entirely different. And this is actually we're going to be talking in general, probably over the next few classes, about things that are quite subtle. And don't be frustrated if it takes some time. We're going to take the time and we're going to try and work these things out well, because the whole point is to understand it, right? So, when God creates the universe, it is unlike the silversmith creating the menorah in exactly one way. The silversmith is given silver. God is given nothing. That's the fundamental difference. That's what the Alter Rebbe is trying to explain to us. The silversmith has silver to work with. God has nothing to work with. There is nothing there. It's before God has created anything. Now,
He has God.
Yeah, he has. God is just God, but he has nothing to work with, right? What is the material from which he will make the world? There is no material, right?
I think it's the other way. God does not need anything to work with.
He doesn't need anything to work with, right? So he doesn't have anything and he doesn't need anything, but the point remains that he doesn't have anything. So, since we have just explained that the entire existence of the human artifact rides on the fact that the silver already exists, because it's a given that the silver is here, so too is it a given that the menorah is here, even once the sculptor has left. When it comes to God's creation, we can make no such argument. By God's creation, you cannot say that the material as a given exists. The material from which God makes the universe, the heavens and the earth exists, and then God simply forms it and makes it into what it is today, right? Into the universe as we know it, let's put it that way. That is not the process of creation, because God is not given a material with which to work. There is no given material. Therefore, when He creates, He is not bringing out, He is not actualizing a potential. He is not bringing out a way of being in His material, because His material is nothing, and nothingness has no ways of being. What does nothing have the potential to become? Nothing. Nothing has no potential because there's nothing there, right?
Potential.
Right? There's nothing. There's nothing there to have a potential, right? The silver exists and therefore has within it the potential to be a menorah. Nothing does not exist, is the opposite of existence, and therefore has no potential to become a universe. Therefore, what God is doing when He is creating the universe is not bringing out a potential. He is not actualizing a potential for a universe in some material that is pre-existent. He is actually creating it. He doesn't just form, He actually creates something from nothing. Right? There is no pre-exist. Nothing was here before, and now there is something. Rather than there was a potential for a thing, and now there is an actual thing. Right? That's the distinction. An artisan takes from the potential and makes actual. God takes nothing, in which there is no potential, and makes something.
Makes anything.
Yeah. Therefore, right, and this is the upswing, this is the conclusion, right? So God must constantly create it, right? God must constantly create it. God must constantly speak it into being. Because as follows. I'll tell you why. What is the universe now that God is creating it, if He has created it from nothing, right? Let's go back to the artisan. What is the menorah now that the artisan has created it? It is silver being in a certain way. Silver that exists, which is being in a certain way. God creates the universe. What is the universe now that God has created it? Right? You cannot say it is nothing being in a certain way. Right? Rather, it is whatever God has added to nothing to make it a universe. Again, you cannot say it is nothing being something, for that is impossible. Right? Nothing cannot be something. Right? Rather, let's put it, rather than nothing being something, because that might confuse things later.
Right.
Let me put it in an easier way. It's not a potential in nothing for a universe that is now being actualized. It's better to be more precise. It's not a potential for a universe in nothing that is now being actualized. Rather, it is nothing plus whatever it is that we don't know that God is doing to create a universe equals the universe. Right? That's the equation. You have zero, a true nothingness, plus the action of God to create a universe equals the universe. And therefore, by simple mathematics, the universe minus the action of God to create it equals absolutely nothing. So what is the universe? Even as God is creating it, the universe now that it exists, it is nothing but, right, it almost sounds like a pun, right? It's nothing other than the action of God, the chayus, the word of God, that God is speaking to bring the universe into existence.
Well, there is a problem.
One second. Before the problem, let me go back and deal with the artisan, and then we'll get to the problem. The artisan, when we have now the menorah sitting on the table, right, the equation is different. It's not nothing plus the artisan equals the menorah, right? It's a piece of silver with a potential to be a menorah, plus the actions of the sculptor equals the menorah, right? You remove the actions of the sculptor, right, and you have not returned to nothing, right? There is still something that exists here even without the sculptor, and that's the main point. The main point, the mistake of the heretic is thus to think that God makes the world as a human artisan creates a vessel, that just as the artisan can leave the vessel and the vessel will remain in existence, so too God can stop creating the world, can cease to be involved in the creation of the universe and everything in it, and the universe would still exist. And the root of the mistake is that they think that God forms the universe. They don't realize that God, what it actually means, that God truly creates the universe. That there was nothing with no potential for being, and God creates something, and therefore the entire identity of the universe is whatever it is that God is doing to bring it into being. There is nothing else to the universe other than the words of God speaking it into existence. And that is what the Alter Rebbe is trying to say.
What they thought.
What who thought?
Like the founding fathers. The deists.
Yeah.
I think what they thought was that God brought it into being and then said, let it rip.
The thing is, what we're saying is that is irrational. If they truly believe that God brought it into being out of nothingness, then that is irrational. That's what we're saying.
No, because you haven't said it. You haven't explained it.
Why cannot God say, let there be something out of nothing, and do whatever God did to create, do whatever God did to create that, and then God simply say, all right, it exists.
What do you mean it exists? From now on it exists?
From now on it exists.
Irrational. Doesn't make sense.
Why does it make sense?
Because again, the entire reason why it is possible to create something and from then on it exists, the existence has to come from somewhere, right? What is making this thing exist? In the analysis of a human object, a human artifact that has been made to exist, it turns out that really the fundamental existence of the thing preceded the one who formed it. All he's doing is changing the way it exists. But that the menorah exists preceded the sculptor. So the fundamental idea that you can make something exist and now it just exists, right? The whole idea, the whole reason, the whole place that the whole root for the thinking that such a thing is possible is because we are used to notions of creation within things that already exist. Right? If you really think about it, and think about how there was nothing and no potential for anything, right? Then God makes something, right? What is the stability
That's the question.
that this something has? That's a different question.
I think you're making a case for the remarkableness of God.
No.
Actually, there are two things. If you look at Makot Mitzrayim, there were two types of makot. One that God made to exist, like when He made the frogs. So the frogs were there, and then that was a miracle to bring them into the world, and then they existed, and God laughed. Look how many frogs there are. The other one is when He made the water to be separated. He had to invest the force all the time for the water to stand, or when He made the water to turn to blood. He didn't stop. He didn't turn the water back to, the water with the blood back to water. He just, stopped maintaining the blood in the water, and then the water came back to water. So we are looking at two different things. One is creating the world. He could have created the world and said, okay,
No,
the world is done.
no, 1 second. We're bringing in too many other things.
Well,
1 second.
My question is
Simple, yeah.
Why are we limiting God to be able to do
That's a different question. That's a different question.
That's a fundamental question.
No, that's a different question. That's a different question. So there's at least two questions here.
Okay.
The question of how we can say that God does anything in a certain way for sure and isn't this limitation on God is a question. That's not the question I'm answering. The first question we're answering, before we get all fancy and religious, The first question we're answering is about what makes sense in the creation of the world. And again, I'm going to explain it again, because like I said, you're right to ask the questions, and I'm going to explain it again, because the whole point is to understand, right? Here's the proposal. The proposal is, like the deist way of thinking, like the founding fathers, as Spencer says. God creates the world. He gives it a certain nature. And then God ceases to be involved in the world. God is walking in the shuk, right? God is elsewhere. The world runs on its own, right? Now, a reasonable question that any rational thinking person can ask is, where does the world come from, right? Remember, we're assuming the world is created from nothing. That's a fundamental assumption. That's the assumption we're working with. So the world is created from nothing, and then it's left to exist. It's left to exist and run on its own nature, and God goes elsewhere, right? The Alter Rebbe is telling us this position is fundamentally irrational. You cannot have a world that is actually created from nothing, that God leaves and goes elsewhere and lets the world run on its own. Because what is keeping the world in existence? Right? That would be the question. And the deist, or the founding father, or the heretic, or whatever we're calling him, would answer, what do you mean what's keeping it in existence? Things exist, right? Things just continue in the way they are, like a menorah, right? The response is, once you've formed something, it simply is, right? They use the metaphor of the watch. It's like a watch that you wound up, right? A watch continues to exist. The watchmaker is gone, and the watch is still lying here, right? To which the Alter Rebbe is saying, you totally misunderstand what it means to make a watch. The reason why the watch is able to still be here, even though the watchmaker is not here, is because the materials from which the watch was formed have a prior existence. That's the explanation. If you ask, how can the watch exist even though the watchmaker isn't here, the answer is, well, the steel existed before the watchmaker was here. Right? The glass existed before the watchmaker was here. All of these things existed before the watchmaker was here. All the watchmaker is doing is making them into a watch. But all the parts were here. All the material that it's made of was here. So what do you mean? It's not a question. The question of how can the watch still be here after the watchmaker is gone, you should ask, how could the steel be in the ground before the watchmaker arrived? It's the same question. All the watchmaker is doing is giving it a new form. Right? But the universe, fundamentally different. Heaven and earth is fundamentally different. Because when you ask, how can the universe be here, even though God wasn't, you have to piggyback this existence on something. You have to say the existence of the universe depends on something. There is a cause for it. Right? Now, if you want to say that the universe exists because it always existed, that there's some sort of material from which it existed, this violates our first principle that we've all agreed on, that the universe has created something from nothing. So if it is created something from nothing, and there is no prior existence on which to posit, on which to ground the existence of the universe as there is now, there is no eternal matter or anything like that Aristotle thought of, because nothing is eternal, because the universe has created something from nothing, right? Then God cannot be separate from the universe now, because otherwise what is causing it to exist? On what does the existence depend?
But how do you know? It could be that God is recreating or maintaining things, every single second or moment.
That's exactly what I'm saying.
And the other one is God created that and it left it to stay.
No. Why? I don't understand.
Why are you putting a limit? Why are we...
That's a separate question. That's a different question.
No, wait a minute.
That's a different question here. That is a different question.
Just a second. We're trying to explain the logic of how it works.
Yes.
But
that's the whole point of the chapter.
Right. But the fact that everything was created out of nothing doesn't make sense at all.
No.
This is God.
Okay, so the answer...
so I can answer the same thing that the question is based on. God can do anything.
Okay, so this is God. Yeah. So why cannot God take the nothing, turn it into something? Doesn't have to get out of it. And from now until further notice, that I tell you, you exist.
Yeah.
No, but that...
I play with you. I created monopoly.
That would mean that it exists just by nature of God being able to do anything. But it doesn't exist in a way that makes sense. It doesn't exist in a way that's rational, in a way that the human mind can understand.
So you're saying what's the difference?
Right? It would be a contradiction. It would be a contradiction. What I'm describing is not a contradiction. In other words, yes, creation something from nothing is not something that we experience. It's something that only God can do. However, the way in which God creates something from nothing nothing is the logical way that it should be based on what we know about creation, that first there was nothing and now there was something. I don't know how God gets from one to the other, but the way that he gets from one to the other must be in a way of constant involvement. That's the only way that makes sense. Right? If it is any other way, then it is just God can say whatever he wants and it could be. Right?
What's wrong with that?
But it's not logical.
What? I didn't say anything. I didn't say anything is wrong with that. I said that I'm giving you the reasonable explanation of what a rational person must conclude when they hear that God creates the universe something from nothing. Everybody's being very clever. You're being very clever. Don't worry. We're going to get to all the clever
Let me give
answers.
another example. At least, for fire. You turn the gas and then you put a match and you have a fire. As long as you don't turn the gas off, the fire is going to be on. That's like one example, because the fire or the fire cannot stand by itself. It requires the gas, for this to exist. The other example, you take a book. You wrote a book, you leave it on a shelf, and the book is there forever.
Yes, I agree. And?
So these are the two different things. One
yes, there's two different things.
The book, once he created it, it's there.
Yes, there's two different things, and there are two different things.
Right, but how can we know? Of course, we read the Torah, and the Torah said that...
No, because one of the things is the way that God creates something, and one of the things is the way that a human being creates something. The gas in the fire is not a real example, obviously. Obviously not a real example.
No,
right? Because you're just providing each atom of gas, which is pre-existent, is now being transformed into fire.
That's what God is doing every single moment. How does those glasses stand? God is making the glass and the metal to exist. Otherwise...
Yes, that's what I'm saying. So why are you agreeing with me so vociferously? I don't understand. Is that not what I'm saying?
I'm saying, there are two different things. One, which you understand that everything is nothing unless God is within it. And the other thing is that God created that, and it's there just by itself.
No, but the second one is illogical. The second one assumes that God is not creating, but God is forming something that already exists.
No, not necessarily.
Why?
Yes, necessarily.
He created glasses out of nothing. Let it be glass.
Doesn't make any sense. Make any sense. How can it be? What's the explanation for the glasses to continue to be there? Right?
God has that.
God, he has the power.
No, God can do whatever he wants is not an answer in this conversation. God can do whatever he wants is not an answer in this conversation. You know what God can do whatever he wants is?
I wish he could do what I want.
God can do whatever he wants is a way of avoiding the issue. It's not an answer. God can do whatever he wants, negates ever. May as well not study the Tanya. God can do whatever he wants. What do you mean? I'm not a perfect tzaddik, but God can see me as a perfect tzaddik. He can do whatever he wants, right? It says, lo zu aderech. It's true. It's a question, and I'm going to give an answer to the question later, probably. But that's not when you're having a discussion about what makes sense, about trying to understand the process of God creating the world, you cannot, it is not productive to end every explanation of everything with, but God can do whatever he wants. Yes, I'm aware God can do whatever he wants. It's a question, we'll answer the question. But that's not what we're doing here. We are explaining rationally. We are explaining to a rational person. Again, you have a rational person. They believe that God creates the universe from nothing. They think that this process of creating the universe from nothing is a process that allows for God to just walk off in the shuk. Right? Not because God can do anything, because that's the nature of the creation. You understand what I'm saying? Not because, when I say God can, of course God can do anything. That's not what I mean when I say God could do anything. So it's probably I've explained to myself now why this is all my fault, really. So it's not because God, when I say God can be walking off in the shuk, I don't mean by dint of the fact that he can do anything. Of course he could. He could do anything. Right? That's not the point. The point is that by the nature of the type of creation that the world is, God does not need to be constantly involved in it. Right? And I am explaining to you that not ignoring for a moment that God can do anything and contradictions can be true, etc., etc., etc. Ignore that. We'll get to that. Ignore that for a moment. Fundamentally, by the nature of creating something from nothing, if you look at what it means that something is being created from nothing, the constant involvement of the Creator is necessary. And when I say necessary, I don't mean necessary to God who nothing is necessary for. I mean necessary in terms of the thing that is being created. What sort of attention from the Creator does the menorah demand? And what sort of attention from the Creator does the universe demand? And the Alter Rebbe's point is that these are fundamentally different things. The menorah does not demand constant attention because the menorah was really something whose existence is assumed beforehand. The existence of the menorah precedes the arrival of the silversmith. The universe is something which does demand the constant involvement of the Creator, because without the Creator, what preceded the universe? What preceded it was nothing, with no potential for anything.
There may be a stronger argument if you say, in order for there to be time,
Yeah.
there has to be constant involvement. And if there's constant involvement, then you're constantly creating.
This is not with time. This has nothing to do with time. This has nothing to do with
The
time.
moment he
Let me have a
presents
go. I
time,
never asked
let
you a
it be
question.
time.
I never asked you a question. Can I have a go?
I didn't say that, though.
No,
He said
right.
it was like-
Nothing plus the force, whatever this force is that God uses to create the universe, equals something. If you take away that force, there's nothing.
Of course, this is very simple mathematics. But I want to go back to the example of the
So
Makot
why is
Mitzrayim.
it logical to
Explaining the
say
different types of Makot Mitzrayim.
it is permanent at this stage?
It is. He's laying the
The second he
foundation.
takes it away,
We're going to build lots
nothing
of
will
things
exist
to
and it will
this.
be
That's
as
the
if it
thing,
never
that's the
existed.
difference.
We haven't gotten to the splitting of the
moment
sea
he
yet.
takes
We'll
it
get to
away.
the splitting of the
that's
sea.
not the fun.
That's part of the
moment
chapter. We'll
he
get to the
does not
splitting of the sea.
invest himself into it, it goes away.
That's
The
what
moment
we're-
it needs to take anything away.
That's what we're
And
saying.
that's the difference
Correct.
of the two things.
That's exactly
Once
what we're saying.
Something needs to be taken away for that to
Exactly, we're
disappear.
all saying the same thing.
Okay.
But you're still saying that there could be this other thing where
Could be.
No.
You don't know.
No, not by, no. Anything could be when you're talking about God, but that's not the question. The question is, by the nature of the thing we're discussing,
let's go-
as understood rationally, could it be? And the answer is no.
So we
it
have an
couldn't be.
example. Can you speak about the Makot Mitzrayim?
No, because that's the next thing in the chapter, and I haven't got to it yet.
Okay.
The splitting of the sea. We'll get there, God willing. Okay.
We're not trying to make it hard on you. It's just something
I understand.
complicated by itself.
I agree. It's complicated. That's
God
why I'm
made it
explaining it again and again. All right.
Well, absent God's involvement, what does it need to say there's history?
Yeah.
What's that again?
Absent God's involvement.
The menorah's gone too.
Let me tell you this. We're going to have a discussion about a few things that were brought up in this conversation, but we're going to do it in an orderly fashion is the point. We're not just going to have a free-for-all. So let me explain to you what we're going to do. First, we're going to talk about what it means that if God were to stop creating the universe, it would be as if it never was at all, what that means. That's the next thing we're going to discuss. After that, we're actually going to read inside a little bit. If there's, I don't know, there probably won't be time tonight. We're going to read further about the splitting of the sea. Then we are going to explain very interesting things that we learn from the metaphor of the Alter Rebbe about the splitting of the sea. On several counts, we're going to learn about the nature of miracles. We're going to learn about a new way of understanding the innovation in the creation, the chidush of the creation. We're going to talk about how the essential nature of being is non-being, which is interesting, which is also connected to what we've been talking about. And then we're going to actually move on to the end of the chapter, which is about apparently different subject entirely. So in short, when we're having these conversations, and it'll be the same thing in chapter 3 and chapter 4, keep in mind that we are only like 6 or 7 lines into the chapter, right? In other words, yes, we have to understand this point first. In other words, let's do it in the Alter Rebbe's order. That's my suggestion. Let's understand this point first, about what the Alter Rebbe is trying to do. The heretic has a question, there's an answer to the heretic. And then building on that point, it is going to get more complex. So does everyone have the point that I'm saying, at least? Regardless of other points, yes? Mm-hmm. Okay. Let's discuss the next thing. We already mentioned This is actually going to touch on what Eyal probably wanted me to discuss. We already mentioned in the previous chapter that if God were to stop speaking the world into existence at any moment, not only would the universe cease to exist, right, by the equation that we were just saying before, by the idea that without God creating it, it is literally nothing. Not only would it cease to exist, but it would be as if it never was. Haya kaloi haya, like before the 6 days of creation. Right? It would be it would have a retroactive effect, it would seem, from the words of the Alter Rebbe. If God ceased to create it, not only would it stop existing, it would be as if it never existed in the first place.
Including all the souls that are...
Everything that existed. If God were to stop speaking it into existence, the universe, the heavens and the earth and everything within them, they would cease to exist as if they never were. What does that mean? What does that mean? When we were
really more like an article of faith.
No, we're going to explain. We're going to try and explain what this means. When we were in yeshiva, actually this isn't in my notes, but it's a fond memory, so I'll mention it. When we were in yeshiva, there was a certain mashpia, a certain teacher of Chassidus. You know, certain different teachers have their lines or the things that they always repeat by their fabrengen, as I'm sure you've noticed from Rabbi Silverman. You know, there's themes, there's certain things that are touched on again and again. There's a certain mashpia, a certain teacher of Chassidus, and he used to ask the Bachrim the following question, right? He would say, are you alive because you're alive, or have you just not been hit by a truck yet? That's the question he would ask the Bachrim. He would say, are you alive because you're alive, or have you just not been hit by a truck yet? Right? In other words, what's he saying? There's two different things. There's living because you happen to not have died, right? In other words, you're living on technicality. Or there is you can be really alive. You can be alive because you're actually alive, not because you haven't been hit by a truck yet, right? That was his point. And obviously there would be a whole fabrengen attached explaining what he means and what it means to really be alive, right? That an authentic chassid, an authentic servant of God, doesn't live their life as a technicality. They live their life for real. They live it authentically. They live life to the fullest. Their life is an actual life, not a life that exists on technicality. So that aveda that idea in the service of God, really applies to the haskalah, to the theology, to the philosophy that we're learning here in Tanya. Because there are two different ways for a thing to not exist. There's two different ways for a thing to not exist. There is happening to not exist, and there is essentially not existing. Let me give you an example. You have a house. We could use the menorah for this. We could use the menorah. But you have a house and someone knocks it down, right? The house happens to not exist. The house happens to not exist. In other words, there's a house. Existence is taken away from the house, which, remember, in human creation and destruction, what does that mean? It means the form is taken away. All that's left is the matter. You have bits of wood and whatever the house is made of lying around. And the house is no longer here. You take away the form, you knock it down, there's no house. Right? So, the house, on principle, in essence, can exist. It existed just moments ago. It happens to be that it no longer exists because someone knocked it down, right? You happen to not be alive because you got hit by a truck, right? In other words, it happens to not be around because someone made it not be around. But in principle, the house would still be standing, right? If it were to essentially not exist, that would mean that once the house is knocked down, the entire notion of the house, the entire, what we'd say in Chassidus, the mahus of the house, the essence of the house would cease to exist, right? In other words, not only would you destroy the physical structure, but the entire possibility of the notion of the house would cease to exist, right? There's two different ways of non-being. There's happening to not exist, and there's essentially not existing. Now, because, as should be clear, what I'm saying now, if you've been following along, this should be an obvious conclusion. As should be clear, when a human being destroys something, they can only destroy it in a way of it happens not to exist. Right? Because, why? Because when we create something, we only create it in a way that it happens to exist. Again, when a human being destroys something, he can only do it in a way of it happens to no longer exist. I knocked down the house and it's not here anymore. Right? But in what sense is it not here? It's not here in the sense that I took away the form. I took that actual form and I reverted it back to what it was before. The menorah. I took away the form of the menorah, I melted it down, and I returned it to silver. Right? So now the menorah happens to not exist. But can I destroy the menorah essentially? And the answer is no, because I can't create the menorah essentially. Right? Human beings work yesh mi-yesh. They work something from something. Right? We can only create something that happens to be, and we can only destroy something. We can only destroy it so that it happens to be destroyed.
I think the scientists would tell you that even if you destroyed it, in our terms, completely, you dropped an atomic bomb.
Right.
The energy of
the energy and the mass would be conserved. Yes. Correct. Absolutely.
It depends on the material.
No.
The point is that fundamentally,
Wood, you burn the wood.
the underlying matter still exists. It's a different form, but it still exists. Is the point? Okay.
the microcosmic.
The underlying material still exists. Conservation of matter, right? Still exists in a different form. It becomes smoke, it becomes ashes, but whatever it is, it still exists. Anyway, in a different form. Essential non-existence only God can do, because essential creation only God can do, as should be fundamental, right? God can make something truly not exist. Now, when God makes something not exist, this is something that Eyal, I think, was mentioning before, or was getting around to mentioning before. When God, makes something not exist, there are two ways he can make it essentially not exist, which, remember, means not just that it happens to not be here. It's not just he's taken away the form, he's taken away the actual underlying essential reality of the thing. There's two ways he could do this. God is the external cause to its non-being, or God is the internal cause to its non-being. Again, so really we have three levels here. The lowest thing is what humans can do, which is making it happen to not exist. You can destroy its being, but not its essence, which is a footnote, a terminology for those who understand it. God can make something truly not exist, neither in being nor in essence. But there's two ways in which he does this. This level itself, this higher level, is itself subdivided into two. He is the external cause to its non-being. In other words, the cup exists, and God, by dint of his mighty powers beyond all logic, which we like to bring up in this class, God's mighty powers beyond all logic will that the cup should no longer exist, and he destroys it. Right? There's a third option.
Drink quickly.
Better drink quickly. The third option is that God makes it not exist internally, from within the cup. What does that mean? That means that really, why does the cup exist? The cup only exists because God is investing his words into the cup at every moment. And if he were to cease his investiture of his words into the cup would utterly cease to exist. Right? From the inside, so to speak. In other words, God is never really external to the cup, right? The idea that God uses his infinite power to destroy his superpowers, to destroy to destroy the cup, that idea is based on the idea that the cup is not dependent on God in the first place. But of course, we know from what we've learned that the cup, because it comes from nothing, right, is constantly being spoken into existence by God. And therefore, how can he destroy the cup utterly? By ceasing to speak. Exactly the situation that the Alter Rebbe describes in Tanya, in what we're learning. That God ceases to speak it into existence, and from the inside, from the very essence of its being, because the very being of the cup in the first place is only God speaking it into existence, he stops to speak, and the thing utterly ceases to exist.
That we talk about?
I don't know. But let me make a distinction again. The idea that God would need to destroy the thing externally is the heretic's position. The watchmaker would say that if God wants to smash the watch, he has to come along and smash it from the outside. According to the Alter Rebbe's position, to destroy the universe, all God has to do is to cease creating it. Correct? If God wanted it to not be, he would simply cease speaking, and it would cease to exist.
Actually, the burning bush, is it still burning?
That's a different... I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that question.
So there's a question about Passover.
1 second.
I see somebody frustrated on this side of those notes last
Let's define this more finely. How much time do we have? We have a few minutes. Let's define this more precisely. I'm going to rely on Rabbi Yoel to help me here. Define this more precisely. That's what he's best at, in my opinion. That's what makes him special, I should say. That's a unique skill of his. If God is the external cause to the non-being, if he uses his power as God to make it cease to exist, as is the heretical position, right? What is that really saying? It's saying that without God's act of destruction, the thing would continue to exist, right? But if the thing in the first place is dependent on God, which is the Alter Rebbe's position, the non-heretical position, then without God, there is no thing even in the first place. Without God, there is no thing even in the first place. In other words, according to the heretical position, the heretical position again holds that God can create something from nothing, right? So God could destroy and revert it back to nothing, right? So in other words, the heretical position does not deny that God could absolutely destroy the universe, right? What does the position miss? The heretical position says that if God were to so destroy the universe, in theory, at least, the essence of the universe, the essence of its being, could continue. Again, even though God could destroy it completely, including its essence, right? Theoretically, in other words, this is a different way of saying it. We're really relying on God's infinite power here, right? We're doing what I was getting frustrated with you guys for doing earlier. We're really relying on God's infinite power for this. Just as God can mysteriously make something from nothing, so too he can revert it back to nothing, right? Which means, what does that mean? I'm going to try and... It's frustrating to not have the right words, but what does that mean? That means that the Hebrew words are easier, right? That mitzad, the geder of the thing, right? In the judging not by God's power, but by the nature of the thing that God is destroying, the thing is able to continue without God, right? The heretic says that God can utterly destroy it. But from whence does this utter destruction come? Why is this utter destruction coming? It's coming from God, not from the thing itself, right? It's coming because God is able to revert something into nothing, right? This thing, if God didn't come and utterly destroy it and revert it to absolute nothingness, would theoretically continue to exist. Right? Theoretically would continue to exist. It needs God to come and make it not be for it to not exist. Otherwise it would continue existing. In other words, from the perspective of the cup, before God comes and unmakes it, uncreates it, right? From the perspective of the cup would just continue on. Right? So where is the destruction of the cup really coming from? It's really coming from God externally. Yes? But if the thing only exists in the first place because God is making it exist, then the lack of existence of the cup is inherent to the cup. It's not that the cup would keep going on its own merry way until God comes and destroys it. Inherent to what the cup is, mitzad, the gather of the cup, it's hard to translate, by the nature of the cup itself, by what the cup is, it is dependent. By its essence, it's dependent. The definition of what it is, it's dependent on God.
What you're really saying is that because God created something from nothing, then to eliminate that something would revert it back to nothing.
Yes.
That is what I'm saying, but I'm saying more than that. I'm saying more than that.
Or internally, it could come.
Even the heretic, again,
In other words, nothingness is the essence of it.
But it could be.
even the heretic admits that God can revert it to nothing. The Alter Rebbe's chidush, the innovation of what the Alter Rebbe is saying, is that really, what he's really saying, is that the cup really never exists to be destroyed in the first place. That's really what he's saying. He's saying that the cup, by its definition, before God comes and destroys it, you ask, what is it? You say it's only an expression of God. So in other words, the cup as an entity that needs to be destroyed never exists. There is no independent reality of the cup that God would need to come and revert to nothingness.
The independent reality.
Therefore, when God ceases to speak and the cup reverts to nothingness, he is not an external cause to the destruction. He is an internal cause. And what does that mean? That means that not only is the thing destroyed from now into the future, the thing is destroyed even retroactively, because what was the thing's existence in the first place? Only God speaking it into existence. Right? So in other words, it's not that the thing is here and now the thing is not here. It's the thing is only here in as much as God is constantly creating it. And if God ceases to constantly create it, then the thing in general never was. There never was such a thing. If God ceases to speak it into existence, then there never was such a thing, because the only aspect protruding, it's hard to describe the picture in my head, the only aspect of the thing protruding beyond nothingness, the only aspect of the thing that is making it more than nothing, is the fact that God is constantly speaking it into existence in the first place. Therefore, if he ceases to speak it into existence and allows it to return to nothingness, in what way does it return to nothingness? All it does is it reveals the truth of what it always was, which is that it always was nothing. There never really was a cup. The cup was only being spoken into existence by God. This is what it means, retroactive destruction. This is what it means, that God destroys it, not just now and into from now on. It's destroyed even in the first place, because the possibility for the thing to even exist, which is only by dint of God's power that makes it exist, has totally ceased to be. Right? There is no previous potential. There is no previous possibility for the thing to exist at all. So if God ceases speaking it into existence, it's not just that the form of the cup's no longer here. It's not just that the essence of the cup is no longer here. It's that it's been revealed that all along what we thought were the being and essence of the cup is really just godliness. We're revealing a truth that was always there, which is why it's retroactive destruction.
But that would be two different situations.
Yeah.
One, God is creating everything from the beginning, every single moment.
Yeah.
And the other one is God is maintaining everything.
That's true. There is a difference, correct?
So, which one is the right one?
I think one of the same.
It depends how you look. It depends how you look at it. It depends for what. That's a complicated discussion. We'll get more into that. That's a good question. We'll get more into that. I just want to add one more thing. I just want to add one more thing. That it says when it would return to absolute nothingness, the Alter Rebbe adds mamish, which means literally. And of course, Rabbi Yoel won't let that fly. He says, what more literally is there to add? Everything that I've just explained to you, it would return to how it was before the 6 days of creation. That seems pretty thorough, right? What does mamish, what does literally add? Right? What does the word add to this understanding? And so Rabbi Yoel says that really what it negates is the idea of planned obsolescence. Right? That if God were to create the world with an internal timer, like the iPhone, right? If God were to create the world with a magic internal timer that suddenly at some point after 6,000 years the world just magically falls apart and ceases to exist, right? You could argue that it is not being caused externally to cease existing, but rather internally, right? It sounds almost similar to the non-being that the Alter Rebbe is describing, that would come about through God ceasing to speak it into being. Right? Because it's internally caused. It's self-caused non-existence. Right? It's not that anyone external to it is coming to destroy it. It just happens, it's created in such a way that it ceases to exist after a certain amount of time. Right? And so Rabbi Yoel says, we are therefore forced to conclude that from the Alter Rebbe's position, it is not just that the thing is caused externally not to exist, but rather that the thing is so non-existent in the first place that the cause of it, that there is no causal explanation for its destruction. Again, it's not just because the Alter Rebbe says mamash, literally it would cease to exist, right? And so far we've been judging the difference between destroying something as the heretic's destruction and the Alter Rebbe's destruction. We've been saying the differences between destroying it externally and destroying it internally. This planned obsolescence says that there's a form of sort of internal self-destruction that's possible, right? Without God having to stop speaking it into existence. Even the heretic could say, there's a plan, the watch is meant to cease existing after a certain amount of time and just fall into nothingness, right? That would be internal, no? So because the Alter Rebbe says mamash, because he says literally would return to nothing, right? He is negating this position. He is negating this position of the heretic, which says that there's this planned obsolescence, this planned internal self-destruction. Rather what? Really, when God ceases to speak the cup into being, it is not just that its destruction is internal to it, and by its own definition, that it is defined by being only an expression of God. Really, the thing is so synonymous with the expression of God, as we were saying before, is so non-existent as its own entity that you wouldn't even say that its destruction needs a cause at all. Its destruction is not internal, its destruction is simply a result of the word ceasing to be. There is no actual destruction of if God were to stop speaking, it's not that the thing would be destroyed from the inside, it's that there is no thing even to speak of. It would just be God ceasing to speak, and sort of almost you would say as a side effect or a natural consequence from a certain perspective, the world would cease to be. And that's really the what the Alter Rebbe is saying when he says it would return to how it was before the 6 days of creation, mamash, literally. It's I managed to make it a whole class without learning a word of the text, but it was good. It was good. We explained some things.
Yeah. So Steve.
Yeah.
Did you ever see the movie?
Yeah.
It's a Wonderful Life.
No.
The story of